I chose Arabic because I was always interested in the Middle East because it's the birthplace of civilization. So that's what drew me to the region, the fact that everything began in the Middle East. I do think it's very important to have lived properly in a country that you're writing about. The French throwing up their hands in horror and saying, our identity is going up in flames. I just thought, well, why are they saying that? Don't they realise that most of the elements of this wonderful cathedral have actually come into Europe via the Islamic world? I think it's understandable that a lot of Europeans who, like me indeed, have been brought up to believe that civilization is Greece and Rome. That book, I think, is probably the most important book I've ever written because it's a completely original thought. Nobody has done that before. This is a completely new theory. My name is Diana Dark, and I've become a cultural historian of the Middle East and author. I never imagined I would become a historian. In fact, going back to school days, history was my least favourite subject. But I think that's because of the way it was taught. And what I've learnt over the course of my career is that history can be looked at from so many different angles. And for me, the important thing is to come at it through the culture, through the people, not through the politics and the chronological events. So my interest with the Middle East began when I decided at university, this was at Oxford, to switch subjects. So I originally was studying German and philosophy as a joint honours course. But then I decided very quickly, actually, during my first term, to switch to Arabic. I chose Arabic because I was always interested in the Middle East because it's the birthplace of civilization. So that's what drew me to the region, the fact that everything began in the Middle East, in those two river valleys, the Tigris and Euphrates and the Nile Valley. So I thought, well, I've never been there. I've got no family connection to that part of the world, but it must be a very, very interesting place. So I thought, well, Arabic will at least give me a route into gradually learning about that area. And I enjoyed it hugely. I loved it. I so enjoyed learning about a completely new culture. And I thought, this is wonderful. I really would like to use my Arabic now in whatever I go on to do in future. So I went to the careers office at Oxford University and I said, I'm going to be graduating in Arabic. What can I apply for that's going to need my Arabic? And they said, well, there are only two things. And they gave me two brochures. One was for the Bank of England and the other one was for GCHQ, which is a branch of the British Intelligence Service. And so I applied for both, but I got right through all of the interviews for GCHQ, but not for the Bank of England. So, of course, I then only had one job offer, so that's what I took. They paid for me to study 18 months modern Arabic, because what I'd studied at Oxford was like classical Arabic. So I was sent to Lebanon to learn in some detail then modern Arabic, and so that was it really. My career was then set in the direction of the Middle East, but of course at that point I was working for the British government. So after my training I worked for the British government in this country and in a couple of other countries, and then still using my Arabic, I went and joined the commercial world and worked for a company called Rakel Electronics, where I was their all-purpose Arabic consultant. And I did that for 10 years. And it was only after that that writing came into my life as a hobby, as a result of a holiday in Turkey. So I went on holiday to Turkey with my husband and thought, what an incredible place. Why hasn't anybody written anything about it? This was in the 1980s, when not many people went to Turkey. And so I thought, well, why don't I write something about it? So, as I said, this is all before the days of the internet. So I went in person to Stanford's bookshop, and I looked at their shelves to see what existed by way of guidebooks on Egypt and Greece, but not on Turkey. Then, because those first books on Turkey were a great success, my timing was just right, perfect. The first edition just sold out like that. And so then, of course, I was asked to write more books, more guidebooks. I wrote about the UAE, I wrote about Oman, and about Tunisia, Jordan, many countries. But then everything then changed, basically, when I was commissioned to write a guidebook to Syria. And then I did my first research trips to Syria, and that was when everything changed, if you like, because it was on that research trip, my first research trip to Syria, that I discovered by chance that it was possible to buy an old house in the old city of Damascus. And I thought, what? How can that be possible? How can they let me, as a foreigner, come in and buy a chunk of a UNESCO World Heritage Site? That would be like a dream come true. So, I immediately decided, against all the advice, everybody said to me, you must be crazy, don't even think about it. But I thought, well, that sounds amazing. I'd really love to pursue that. So with the help of the Syrian friends I'd made by that stage, indeed, everything fell into place to do with that house in a way that made it seem as if it was somehow predestined to happen. From that point, buying the house changed everything. It took me back into the academic world. It took me back to studying an MA in Islamic art and architecture, because I really wanted to understand the house. I was so fascinated with the patterns on it, the way the shapes were, the design, the sort of harmony, the rhythm of the whole thing fascinated me, and I wanted to understand it all at a deeper level. So this is why, I did a 2-year then MA at SOAS. I had 3 years of the restoration project, an absolutely wonderful experience with a Syrian architect and a team of 15 Syrian and Palestinian craftsmen. It was just wonderful. I learnt so much. And I had several really wonderful years in Damascus until the revolution, of course, broke out in March 2011. And then everything changed all over again. It was as a result then of everything that happened during the revolution that I wanted very much to write my first book that was not a guidebook, the book that I called My House in Damascus, which was basically telling the story of the Syrian revolution through the house. The house was the main character. The British government had a school for Arabic in the mountains above Beirut called Shemlan, Mikas it was known as, and so I was sent there to study modern Arabic. This was in 1978, so I was 22 by then, and the remarkable thing, of course, was that Lebanon was in the middle of its civil war at that time. But the school was judged to be safe. It was up in the mountains, in a village, above Beirut. I found a ferry that went from Volos in Greece direct to Tartus in Syria. And so my first landfall, if you like, in Syria was age 22, arriving in my rickety deux chevaux, coming down the ramp into a very chaotic Tartus harbour, and driving off through the port authorities and everything, getting my car stamped and my passport stamped. It was an incredible experience. And then driving off down over the mountains and into Beirut. In those days, Syria was the safe haven. Lebanon was at war. And so whenever there was a weekend or a break of some sort in the course, I would jump into my deux chevaux car and drive up over the mountains and into Syria. So that's when I really got to know Syria, you know, at a young age. I mean, I was 22, driving around Syria, often on my own, sometimes with other students from the course. And I had such a wonderful time. I mean, everybody says, surely it must have been difficult as a woman, you know, blonde at that time, traveling around. And I said, no, it was always very straightforward. And when my car broke down, as it regularly did, people would just come and help me. And they wanted nothing for it. It was the same experience, you know, during my restoration of the house. I was never ripped off as a foreigner. No, I had very, very good memories of Syria from those days, all that time ago, which is why when I was then, you know, many years later, offered the chance to do a guidebook to Syria, I jumped at the chance and I said, wow, yes, I'd love to go back to Syria. I've had so many good experiences with Syrian people. The 3-year restoration project that I did was so eye-opening to me, and I was helped by so many. I couldn't possibly have done it on my own. There was just no way I could have done it on my own, but people helped me because they could see that that it wasn't about the money for me. It was always about restoring a piece of Syria's cultural heritage. They could tell that I was genuinely interested in the culture of the country. I could save one house and then, you know, let it be used for Syrian cultural purposes. That was always my dream, really, that it would be a bit like the British Council in Syria, you know, some sort of cultural institution. It could still be that in the future, you know, who knows what it might become. But through that house, I've made so many extremely good Syrian friends, and I couldn't have got so deeply into the society without that experience. And it's definitely coloured the way I see Syrian history, Syrian politics, everything. I understand it from you know, a much more Syrian perspective than if I was some analyst sitting in some think tank thousands of miles away. I do think it's very important to have lived properly in a country that you're writing about. I think it makes a real difference to how you understand events that are unfolding. You get a better sense. So just as one example, you know, with what's happened recently in Syria, you know, on December the 8th, this astonishingly fast collapse of the Assad regime, and then Abu Muhammad al-Julani, who became Ahmed al-Shara. The way I understand that event, I've noticed, is very different to the way that a lot of Western analysts understand it, because I can feel it through my own Syrian experiences, and I can understand what has happened and the way he himself, Ahmed al-Shara, relates to Syrian culture and civilization. He himself has a very deep understanding of it and has studied it extensively, and many Western analysts have just sort of seen in him a jihadi. Once a jihadi, always a jihadi, end of story. I have never seen it like that. I have seen this man, yes, went through various iterations, you know, went to Iraq, joined Al-Qaeda, did all of these things as part of his journey, part of his learning process to learn how to handle the politics. His aim was always to overthrow the Assad regime, so he needed to get experience of the best way to go about this. And having gone to Iraq, met all these people in prison, including al-Baghdadi, he decided that the ISIS route, the al-Qaeda route, was not the correct route to do it. He did it his own way in Idlib. And because of the way he did that and the fact that I understood it and that I'd been following it, once it happened, I felt this huge relief, which I think was felt by many Syrians, that they thought, finally, somebody is in charge who really understands Syria, and what's more, he's done it without foreign intervention. I mean, that's just extraordinary. So, and I hope I'm going to be vindicated here, because again, you know, there is this it's like chorus of anytime anything goes wrong in the new Syria, people, Western analysts seize on it, what's been happening in the south with the Druze on the coast, with the Alawis and with the Kurds in the northeast. Every time there's an incident, it gets played out and it's not seen in the bigger picture, because of course there are going to be incidents like this. It's inevitable given Syria's history. But they're relatively low key. I mean, in the scale of things, the amount of bloodshed has been very low, actually. So my own feeling is that, I feel I see it through different eyes. And I think the reason I see it through different eyes, when I say different, I mean different to most Western eyes, is because of my experience and my understanding of Syria from a Syrian perspective. My book, Stealing from the Saracens, again, indirectly came out of my experience of restoring the house, but directly it came from the fire in Notre Dame in April 2019, when I saw the French throwing up their hands in horror and saying, "Oh, our identity is going up in flames." I just thought, well, why are they saying that? Don't they realise that most of the elements of this wonderful cathedral have actually come into Europe via the Islamic world? And because nobody seemed to be aware of that, I felt I wanted to put the record straight and write a book about it. The title, Stealing from the Saracens, and the cover of the book, which shows the interior dome of St. Paul's Cathedral, is all very deliberate, because Christopher Wren, one of the most famous British architects, who built St. Paul's Cathedral, he said, "I used Saracen vaulting in the dome of St. Paul's because it was the best." And he said 300 years ago that what we call the Gothic style should rightly be called the Saracen style. He saw many elements in Gothic, what was called Gothic, which is a term, incidentally, that was only invented in the 1500s by an Italian art critic called Vasari. He's also the person who invented the term the Renaissance. These are new terms that art historians have come up with. So that book, it begins with the fire at Notre Dame and Christopher Wren, and then it traces all the elements of Gothic, so-called Gothic architecture, back to the Middle East, and shows the origins in much earlier Islamic buildings and some pre-Islamic buildings as well, and shows how it then entered into European architecture. To me, it was blindingly obvious, and what I've found is that for people who never thought about it before, once I explain it to them, and once they read the book and see the pictures in the book, they say, "Actually, now that you've explained it, it's kind of obvious. I can't believe I didn't notice it before." It's just about retraining your eye to notice the features. I'm particularly proud, actually, of one of the endorsements that that the book received from Rowan Williams, the former Archbishop of Canterbury. So this is, the head of the Church of England understood what I was writing about and approved of it and could see it for himself. And he's a highly educated man. And so the fact, if the head of the Church of England is prepared to accept what I'm saying, then I feel on pretty secure ground, So obviously there'll always be art historians who will push back, who are Gothic specialists, who want it to stay the way they've been taught it. For example, there's a whole chapter in the book devoted to Venice, and that chapter is based to a large extent on the work of a scholar who was the Cambridge Professor of Architectural History, and she devoted 10 years of her life to studying the links between Venice and Islamic architecture. And she does a brilliant job of proving that the Venetians loved Islamic architecture, and they brought in, they copied directly from palaces in Cairo, palaces in Damascus, in Aleppo. They saw the features there, they loved them, and they brought them into their own palaces. And what's more, they were very open about it. It was only us much later in Europe who talk about Venetian Gothic when it should rightly be called Venetian Saracenic. I think it's understandable that a lot of Europeans who, like me indeed, have been brought up to believe that civilization is Greece and Rome. I mean, I was brought up in my education system, that's what I was taught. And it was only once I switched to study Arabic and went beyond Greece that I saw for myself that the Greeks actually took quite a lot of their things. So in architecture, they took the shape of the temple, the pediment like that, they took that from the Urartians that were a much earlier civilization in Anatolia. So everything has its antecedent, everything builds on everything else. The Greeks didn't suddenly magic all this stuff out of nowhere. I mean, just like the Arab Muslims didn't magic it all out of nowhere either. For example, of the Umayyads, who came out of the Arabian Peninsula and they made Damascus their capital. When they wanted to build the Umayyad Mosque, for example, most of the architects there would have been Christians, would have been Christian Byzantines, because they were the top skilled people at the time. And so the mosaics, which are all around the courtyard of the Damascus Umayyad Mosque, will have been done by Christians, but they're now working for Muslim masters and are therefore depicting the Islamic paradise. And exactly the same thing happened then in reverse when the Muslims come to Spain and they become the top craftsmen, and then the Christians come in and conquer Spain. They use Muslim craftsmen to build their cathedrals and their palaces because they're the best. It's back to the same argument as Christopher Wren said all those years ago, that if you're the top person, the new ruler, and you've got the money and the power, you go for the best craftsman. You'll always go for the best because you want a building that's going to be, a statement and a proper reflection of your own power. So after stealing from the Saracens, I had not intended to write another book about Islamic architecture and its influence on Europe. But it was a curious set of circumstances that to do with a fascination with zigzags. There'd been this zigzag pattern around my courtyard, and I'd always wondered what it was, and nobody could tell me. Nobody in Syria could tell me, nobody in this country could tell me. And then by chance, by watching a documentary called The Secret History of Writing, suddenly I had a eureka moment from watching that documentary. The ancient Egyptians, their hieroglyph for water was a zigzag, and that had formed the basis then of the first phonetic alphabet that we had all taken in. So Arabic, English, all the alphabets in the world derive from this Canaanite script. So as soon as I understood that, I realized, of course, this zigzag is water flowing around my courtyard, and it's flowing water coming out of a spring, which is shown as a little circle. And all the ancient Ottoman buildings in Damascus have got this pattern, the same pattern as in my house are running around. And that I was able to track that zigzag pattern from the ancient Egyptians down into the Coptic art and architecture, and then the Fatimids took it on, and then it passed across North Africa, and of course the Fatimids conquered Sicily and were there for nearly 300 years, and then the Normans conquered Sicily and then adopted the zigzag into their architecture. And then, lo and behold, the zigzag pops up in Durham Cathedral back here when the Normans bring it over to Britain. And so in all the history books, art history books, you will read that this is the Norman zigzag. And I immediately thought, my goodness, hang on a minute. Norman, by the way, is the same as Romanesque. It's in this country we call it Norman, but in the rest of Europe it's Romanesque. It's the period which is before Gothic. And the important thing there, so by calling my book Islamesque, I'm deliberately challenging the concept of Romanesque. So it's a very pioneering book, actually. I'm saying, look, if you're going to call it anything, you should at least call it something more accurate, like Islamesque, because again, what I show in the book is how every feature, including the zigzags turn out to be just the tip of the iceberg. Every feature that people call Romanesque has actually come in to Europe via Muslim Spain and via Muslim Sicily, and entered, and then you see the same patterns occurring in Romanesque so-called cathedrals, in the churches and cathedrals. So this is why this really is quite a revolutionary book, and it turns upside down the whole concept of European art history, actually, because what we're saying is that Romanesque is considered the essential springboard for Gothic and then the Renaissance, everything that comes after. And what I'm saying is, actually, the essential springboard for everything that came afterwards in Europe is Islamesque. It was the Islamic world that gave us all of this. And without that springboard, without that essential foundation, we would not have been able to go on to build Gothic and then, forward into the Renaissance. And I show in the book that Muslim craftsmen at that time were 200 years ahead of their European counterparts. Their understanding of vaulting systems, of geometry, they were literate, they could read and write in a way that European craftsmen simply could not at that time. We're talking 11th and 12th centuries. That book, I think, is probably the most important book I've ever written, because it's a completely original thought. Nobody has done that before. This is a completely new theory of mine, and I couldn't have arrived at that theory without the experience of restoring my house. It's come out of a real lived experience. So as well as the books about architecture, I've written another couple of books that are different to books I've written before. One of them is a biography, so it's the only biography I've ever written, and it's of a Syrian textile merchant in Homs, and the family asked me to write the biography of this man because I knew him. I knew him as an old man shortly before he died, because he had such an interesting life, and his father died when he was 10, and he had 6 sisters, so he had to become the head of the household aged 10. And then he lost everything in Syria, and he lost everything in Beirut in the Lebanese civil war, and then he ended up coming over to this country and buying a textile mill in Bradford, and setting up an international textile industry that selling cloth, high-level cloth that's still run by his own 4 sons. And so that was a completely different style of book, and I decided to do that as a sort of parallel history. So there's the personal strand, and then there's the period of history that went with that. So I'm doing it side by side. So that was a very novel way of doing it. That was my own idea. I hadn't seen that done before. And then the other book I was asked to write was the story of the cat man of Aleppo, because he became quite a figure, actually, during the war, setting up a cat sanctuary. And then during the fall of Aleppo, in the siege, the sanctuary was bombed, and he tells the story of how they had to escape, and they were displaced, to Idlib. He only spoke Arabic, and he of course was stuck there in Aleppo and in Idlib at a time when I couldn't travel to Syria. So the way I had to do that book was with the help of some Syrian refugee friends who used to live in my house in Damascus, but they were now Syrian refugees in Beirut. They established the connection with him, so I was his voice. So the book is written as if I am him, and it's written in the first person, giving his story from his own point of view. So again, it's the first time I'd ever written a book like that, as a complete one-off. I'm proud of that book. That was, it gave me the chance to give him a voice, the cat man of Aleppo. And the book did well. It was read by a lot of people. One thing I'm never asked about, and probably the reason is because not many people know about it, is that I'm also a trained graphologist, a professional graphologist, and that means a handwriting specialist. And back in 2000, I did a 2-year MA to become a qualified graphologist, and I've used it. I've been an expert witness, for example, in court cases where to do with fraud. I'm one of the few people that can be called on in this field. And the other field I've used it in, where I found it to be incredibly helpful, is in analysing the handwriting of various Arab leaders. Saddam Hussein, I was able to see his handwriting when he, after 2003, when he went into hiding, he produced a lot of letters from what turned out to be his cave and things, and people were talking at the time about how, oh, he will commit suicide. And from my own analysis of his writing, I said, this man will never commit suicide. His belief in himself is so strong. He has this vision, and he sees himself as the leader. And indeed, right up until he was hanged, he proclaimed he was still the president of Iraq. So I felt vindicated with that as well. And the Times newspaper actually published something that I wrote about that at the time. Graphology, when it's practiced badly by amateurs, is obviously a load of rubbish. But if you've been properly trained, then it's a very important skill. I get a lot of feedback, very positive feedback from the Islamic world. So, for example, I've been invited to the Lahore Literary Festival, where they loved Stealing from the Saracens, they loved Islamesque, the Jaipur Literary Festival. And I've been invited to the King Faisal Center in Saudi Arabia to give talks on Islamic architecture, which again seems incredible that I, as a foreigner, should be invited to give talks. But actually, it was rather wonderful because they said to me, "You've done more for Islamic architecture than we have, in the modern age, in that you've showed us the power of it and how it's influenced Europe." And maybe that's true. Maybe because, people, especially in the academic world, tend to stay within their boxes. So if you're an Islamic art specialist, then you write about Islamic art and architecture. You don't cross the divide to also talk about European things. The same with the Romanesque and Gothic specialists. They don't tend to go outside their boxes. So what I've done that's unusual, if you like, and which I think has been well received by people who are more open-minded, is to bridge that gap between European culture and Islamic culture, and to show the borrowings and to show how much we owe to the Islamic world, because I think it really deserves to be acknowledged. In more recent years, that the West has become more prepared to acknowledge that the colonial times are over, and that when it got to write the version of history, if you like, the colonial version, but obviously the victor always gets to write the narrative of what happened in history. And it's only people who come along later who get to challenge that. I never set out to challenge it. I mean, I made observations that I genuinely believe to be true, and I've written about them. So I haven't set out to be a controversial person. I mean, I'm not by nature a confrontational or controversial person. So, I mean, I've surprised, if you like, to even find myself in this position. I would never have predicted that I would be pioneering a whole field of architecture, pointing out the relationships between European and Islamic architecture. I mean, and it couldn't possibly have happened anyway without the lived experience of restoring my house. I mean, it definitely all goes back to that. If I had to summarize my journey as a historian, I would say that the important thing is to always be true to yourself, follow your instincts. That's what I've always done. I mean, I've never had a preconceived plan. I've just been open to new ideas as I've noticed them. And I think it's important to keep an open mind, listen to things from all angles, and make sure that you're taking a big picture view. In today's very difficult, troubled world, I think it's incumbent on historians to paint as accurate a picture as possible and to try to make sure that that the people's experiences are recorded, and that history gives a fair reflection of events. And it's again, I think it's very difficult to do unless you fully are involved in a country and understand it at a deeper level. I think it's very important always, as I say, to see the bigger picture, to see, not to over-focus on isolated incidents and blow them up into things, but to see a more coherent, bigger picture, because that's ultimately the way you'll see your way through to a better future.